Hey guys, tonight we step into a world where the scent of fresh hops competes with beeswax candles, where the hum of chant merges with the gentle gurgle of boiling wood. You find yourself in a cloistered convent, not in silent prayer exactly, but in full brewing mode. It's somewhere in 14th century Europe, let's say Germany, though frankly, this could just as easily be Belgium or even Yorkshire. What matters is that you're here, surrounded by stone walls and ivy-covered cloisters, peering into a low-beamed room thick with steam and the sweet tang of fermentation. At this point, you're probably expecting monks. But surprise, tonight's star brewers wear wimples, not robes, and they have sleeves rolled up, stirring large copper kettles with wood-on paddles nearly as tall as they are. The abbess has a ladle in one hand, and a suspiciously joyful twinkle in her eye. You'll want to watch your step-spilled barley mash is slippery, and those habits don't exactly come with traction soles. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know, where are you listening from? And what time is it where you are? Drop a comment below. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You walk slowly between the wooden casks stacked to high against the stone wall, marveling at the craftsmanship. Each one is marked with Latin inscriptions, some reverent, others suspiciously like inside jokes. The one you're leaning near says Dio Groshes. The Team 26. First batch to asterisk not asterisk explode. Encouraging. The nuns begin before sunrise, and yes, it's partly spiritual. Brewing was part of their labor offering, done in obedience and humility. But let's not sugarcoat this, it also helped fund the convent. With men in the surrounding village gone for trade, war, or pilgrimage, these sisters held a kind of domestic economy together with barley, yeast, and a whole lot of trial and error. Historians still argue whether the earliest nun brewers learned from monks or developed their own methods independently. The records are murky, and let's face it, medieval scribes weren't great at crediting women. But evidence from places like the Abbaye de Sainte-Marie in France and the Kloster Naumburg in Austria suggests these women weren't just brewing, they were innovating. You duck your head as you step into a side alcove of the brew house. There's a trough, a hand-carved straining basket, and an iron hook used for suspending the mash pot over an open fire. The heat is intense, and you can feel your skin doing with sweat. Across the room, Sister Gertrude Age, unknown, attitude eternal, lifts a clay mug to taste the morning's wort. She frowns, then adds a handful of dried meadowsweet. Medicinal, flavor, revenge, hard to say. You wouldn't last a day here. The brewing schedule alone is brutal. Up before dawn. Water hauled in buckets, barley ground by hand, hops foraged or traded, every barrel scrubbed with vinegar and boiling water. And then there's the cleaning. Oh, the cleaning. Even the Virgin Mary would wrinkle her nose at the stench of a brew gone bad. But the beer, when it worked, was glorious. Not just drinkable, nutritious. It was thicker than modern lager, cloudy and heavy with B vitamins, which made it especially valuable in fasting seasons. And since water was often a bit murder, why back then, beer became the safe, everyday beverage, including for children. Yes, medieval toddlers were sipping what we'd now call weak ale with their porridge. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some convents brewed a pre-dawn mass beer for the sisters to sip before service. Not enough to tip the chalice, but enough to warm them up in those unheated chapels. Was it pious? Was it practical? Historians still debate the intent, but no one denies the results. The sisters showed up on time and rarely nodded off mid-liturgy. And while monks had the scriptoriums, the illuminated manuscripts, the Gregorian chants, nuns had beer that actually turned a profit. Think of it as a liquid ledger, frothy, fermented act of survival. You run your hand along the rim of a barrel labeled Hildegard's Reserve, dated nearly 2 centuries before the concept of yeast was even understood. Through a small window, light filters in like golden honey across the flagstones. The bell tolls for lords. Most sisters are already wiping their hands on aprons and quietly heading toward the chapel. But a few linger. Sister Clara stays to stir. Always one more round of boiling before prayer. Outside, the convent garden shivers in the early mist. Inside, the yeast is just beginning to wake. You follow the shuffle of wooden clogs across the stone floor as the sisters vanish into the chapel, but your attention drifts back toward the quiet gurgle of the kettle. It's still early, and the silence that settles over the brew house now feels sacred not just in the religious sense, but in the deeply human way that peace arrives after hard, shared work. A vow of silence, it turns out, pairs surprisingly well with brewing. The stillness lets you hear the soft hiss of the boil, the faint creak of a stirring paddle leaning against the stone wall. Even the occasional blip as a bubble of yeast releases a bit of trapped carbon dioxide. You imagine how this silence, this focused solitude, must have sharpened the nun's attention. Maybe Sister Clara wasn't just devout, maybe she was listening for the moment when the word shifted from sour to sweet. Of course, not all of them were silent all the time, but many orders, especially the Benedictines and Cistercians, practiced long hours of quiet labor. And brewing, unlike the clanging work of blacksmiths or the chatter of communal kitchens, seemed tailor-made for a contemplative life. You sit on a low bench by the mash tun. Steam rises steadily, catching in the slant of morning light, and the air smells warm and earthy, half tea, half bread, with a hint of old copper. A fly buzzes lazily near your ear, but even it seems to respect the hush. There's something undeniably tender about the way these women brew. The movements are deliberate, almost choreographed. A stir, a lift, a sprinkle. No yelling, no scolding, just quiet precision. A kind of brewing ballet. You start to wonder if silence was less about obedience and more about optimizing the workflow. Fewer distractions, fewer mistakes. Some scholars suggest this quiet brewing environment may have given nuns an edge, at least in consistency. The theory goes that minimal disturbance during fermentation kept microbial contamination lower. Now, whether medieval nuns understood microbiology, highly unlikely, but did they intuit that a quiet room made for a better beer? Possibly. Historians still argue whether this was intentional wisdom or happy accident. One fringe detail you'll love. In a 15th century manuscript from a Flemish convent, a brewing recipe ends not with a list of ingredients, but with this note: asterisk, remain still, speak none, lest the beer froth with wrath. Asterisk, was that superstition? Or proto-science disguised as spiritual advice? Either way, it's wonderfully poetic. You glance to the wall, where a crew chart is scratched into plaster, a kind of brewing calendar, marked by feast days and moon phases. There's a funny little drawing next to Pentecost, a barrel with angel wings. You suspect someone in this convent had a sly sense of humor. Despite the serenity, the process is physically grueling. One nun stirs while another shovels cooled mash into woven baskets. The third pours filtered wort through a funnel lined with sackcloth. No pumps, no thermometers, just strength, timing, and memory. There's no shouting instructions, only eye contact and knowing nods. They've done this hundreds of times. The silence isn't just discipline, it's trust. You help carry a bucket of wort to the fermenting room cooler. Darker, smelling faintly of damp stone and old yeast. The barrels here are shorter, wider, with wooden lids that sit loosely on top. A few are covered with linen soaked in wine, an old trick to deter flies. One sister bows her head in brief prayer before placing the lid on a full barrel. A ritual, a habit, or maybe just gratitude that the batch didn't scorch. And then you see something odd. On the far wall, behind a row of elderberry wine jugs, is a small wooden plaque. It reads, *Silence is the yeast of wisdom. You smile, sleepily, maybe, but it lingers. As you turn to leave, your hand brushes against a folded bit of parchment stuck to a shelf beam. It's old, frayed at the corners, smudged with what might be worth stains. You squint at the faded script. A simple line. Listen for the stillness before the boil. You don't know who wrote it. But you do know this. In a world where monks sang and scribes shouted and town criers bellowed, these women let the quiet do the talking. And sometimes the quiet spoke best through beer. You wake from a short doze on that creaky bench, legs stiff, back warm from the nearby fire. Outside, the sun has crept higher, stretching long shadows across the convent courtyard. But inside the brew house, the scent has shifted. The mash is finished. And now, it's yeast time. You follow Sister Clara again, this time to a side room, cooler and slightly damp, where jars sit in rows like small relics. Most are clay, a few glass, and all sealed with wax. She lifts one gently and cracks it open. A puff of tart, bread-like scent escapes alive, unmistakably yeast. Modern brewers know yeast as Saccharomyces cerevisiae or Pastorianus but these sisters, they called it God's gift, or, more charmingly, the blessed foam. And you can't help but chuckle at that. Not bad for a bunch of women who didn't know about single-celled organisms. Of course, they knew yeast worked. But what it was that was still in the realm of holy mystery. Some believed it floated down from heaven, especially when brews fermented spontaneously after being left uncovered. Others claimed it lived in the wooden paddles, which were never washed too thoroughly, just rinsed with prayer. You watch as Clara spoons a bit of yesterday's foam into the fresh wort. She stirs slowly, murmuring a hymn under her breath. It's the quietest, most reverent science experiment you've ever seen. And here's where things get quirky again. Some convents had yeast keepers, nuns whose sole job was to tend the starter culture. Like a sordo. Sister Margarethi in one Bavarian abbey even gave hers a name, Little Brother Froth. Historians still argue whether this anthropomorphism reflected spiritual belief or just the need for some company in long silent hours. You glance round the shelves. There are scraps of old recipes, some written on cheap vellum, others scratched into wood. They're not precise, not like modern brewing instructions. No temperature readings, no gravity measurements. Just phrases like boil till the scent is sweet or add when the starlings sing at dusk. One recipe ends with, use the third jar from the back, if it still bubbles. If not, pray again. You can't help but grin. As the yeast begins its invisible work, the room warms ever so slightly. It's the kind of heat you don't notice at first until your cheeks feel flushed and the scent goes from barley tea to something richer, almost intoxicating. The fermentation process, in its earlier stages, looks a bit like witchcraft. Tiny bubbles creep up the sides of the barrel. The surface begins to shimmer, and there's that faint popping sound, like distant raindrops on a wooden roof. You stare, a bit mesmerized. Honestly, if you weren't so tired, you'd swear it was breathing. Some nuns swore that certain hymns help the yeast wake faster. One manuscript from an Irish abbey recommends chanting Psalm 100 for during the string, with special attention to verse 15, and wine that maketh glad the heart of man. Coincidence or clever branding. It's worth noting, too, that brewing wasn't always just for the sisters themselves. They brewed for pilgrims, paupers, and sometimes for trade, though this wasn't officially allowed. Many abbeys claimed their beer was for sacramental nourishment. But let's be honest, those barrels rolling out the gate weren't heading to mass. That raises another fun little fact. The convents often brewed different grades of beer. Strong ales for guests or sickbeds, weaker small beer for daily drinking, and something in between for those long fasting days when food was scarce but prayer was plenty. You lift a sample mug to your lips. It's still early in fermentation, a bit raw, but already flavorful grassy, tangy, with a faint clove aftertaste. You're surprised by how smooth it is. Clara winks. She points to a scrap of parchment tacked to the wall. Asterisk, do not drink until the saints rise, unless you wish to join them early. Asterisk, safety advice, or just another joke in a long line of sleepy convent humor. Either way, you've tasted the holy foam and you're still standing. For now, the scent of fermenting ale clings to your clothes as you step outside for air, into a courtyard wrapped in vines and the low murmur of birdsong. The nuns have finished lauds and are back at their chores, some in the herb garden, some mending linens, others hauling empty barrels. It's a rhythm, a gentle pulse to life here. But behind the peaceful pace lies something far more practical. Brewing wasn't just a sacred task, it was a serious business. You watched two sisters load a handcart with freshly sealed casks. They're headed to the village, about a half-mile down a dirt road, to deliver the latest batch of convent ale. You follow at a lazy pace, letting your feet sink into the soft earth, listening to the wooden wheels creak like an old hymn sung sideways. This isn't charity work, it's economics. Convents like this one needed income. They may have been spiritually independent, but in material matters, they had to get scrappy. Land had to be maintained, candles bought, repairs made. And when the bishop's tax collector came knocking, vows of poverty didn't cover roof leaks or winter fuel. Beer, it turned out, was the golden goose. It required only grain, water, and time and a little divine patience. You pass a few village boys kicking a bundle of rags like a ball. One of them stops to watch the nuns trundle past, wide-eyed. A moment later, he nudges his friend and whispers, "That's the one that makes the Vesper brew. My dog says it's got a kick like a donkey." You grin. That's probably the strongest compliment medieval brewing ever got. At the tavern, the landlord greets the sisters with the respect usually reserved for bishops or mercenary captains. He inspects a barrel, nods, and disappears inside. Moments later, a young barmaid emerges with a basket of cheese and dried apples, payment in kind. The exchange is wordless, as usual, but efficient. Historians still argue whether these beer trades were legal under canon law. Technically, nuns weren't supposed to run businesses, especially ones involving alcohol. But technically it was a flexible term, as long as no one got drunk in public, and the abbess paid her dues. Most bishops looked the other way. Besides, there was an unspoken truth in medieval Europe. Good beer and forgiveness, or at least plausible deniability. You rest on a stone bench near the village square as Sister Agnes explains, mostly with hand gestures, how they rotate barrels between taverns, inns, and private households. The convent kept strict records, sometimes even marking barrels with colored wax seals to indicate strength. Blue for light ale, red for medicinal, gold for do not open before Sunday. A quirky tidbit: one convent in northern Italy used wooden stoppers carved into little saint faces. You could tell how strong the beer was by how worried the saint looked. Smiling Saint Francis, safe, cross-eyed Saint Jerome. Proceed with caution. You wander a bit farther and see a local merchant haggling with another nun over the price of grain. She doesn't speak a word, just raises one eyebrow and scratches something on a slate. He blinks, then nods. There's power in being underestimated. By the time you return to the convent, the sun is tilting west. A few of the younger nuns are back in the yard, rinsing barrels with vinegar and ash water. You help one of them tip the last of the day's mash into a compost heap, where it'll feed next season's barley crop. The cycle, like everything else here, is tight, efficient, and oddly elegant. And it dawns on you These women weren't just brewing beer. They were running a sustainable microeconomy, cloaked in devotion and silence. The abbess, tall and hawk-eyed, walks past you carrying a ledger bound in stiff leather. She doesn't slow down, doesn't need to. Everything here runs smoothly because the beer runs smooth. And if it just so happens to be better than the monk's stuff down the valley, well, the Lord works in mysterious, and sometimes mildly tipsy, ways. By the time you duck back into the brew house, the air has cooled a little, and so has the wort. Fermentation barrels sit quietly, now no longer bubbling, just resting, letting the yeast finish its invisible magic. But Sister Clara isn't idle. She's preparing something a bit more refined. Tasting day. You didn't think this was just about boiling and waiting, did you? No. These nuns had palates as sharp as their rosary beads. And if monks were known for copying manuscripts, nuns like Clara were writing tasting notes before that was even a thing. She hands you a wooden mug. Inside, a murky amber liquid, still warm from the fermenting room. You take a sip. It's dense, slightly sour, with a trace of honey and herbs. You swallow, and it lingers just enough spice to make you blink. She watches, then nods with the same satisfaction you imagine a baker has when the loaf doesn't cave in. And here's the wild thing, some of these women were really good at this. Take Sister Walpurga, from a 12th century Swabian convent. Historical letters describe her as having a miraculous nose that could tell when the barley was too dry, when the hops were too young, and when a brew had soured without ever tasting it. Another nun, Sister Emiliana, kept a color-coded chart of herbs that paired best with different malts. She even noted which ones were safer during pregnancy, which, okay, is a little eyebrow-raising in a convent, but also kind of genius. Historians still debate whether these sensory talents were trained or just natural. Some say nuns were allowed greater freedom with recipes because they weren't expected to fight in wars or handle liturgy. Others think it was simply a matter of survival. When you're feeding a cloister, you want your best taster in charge. And remember, medieval beer wasn't filtered, pasteurized, or even refrigerated. One bad batch could make half there be sick, so the stakes were real. Clara takes a second mug from the bench, then another. Each one is slightly different, one brewed with wild sage, another with blackberries picked from the hedgerow. You sip your way through them, marveling at the variety. Then she pulls out a blindfold. Wait, what? She gestures. Sit. You oblige. She ties it on, gently but firmly. And then you hear her laugh under her breath. It's not mocking, it's playful. Apparently, today's lesson includes humility. You hold out your hand. A mug is pressed into it. You sip. This one is nutty, almost buttery, with something sharp at the end. Juniper, maybe. No idea. You guess hazelnut and hear a soft snort of amusement. Another mug, this time sour, like cider vinegar, but with caramel notes. You guess again. Wrong again. Turns out, this is her game. Sister Clara runs blind tastings to keep her sisters sharp. They trade guesses, record impressions, and adjust recipes accordingly. Not by science, not by spreadsheet, but by memory, sensation, and repetition. There's a joy in this, a quiet kind of power. And you realize that in this cloister, taste isn't just pleasure, it's precision. In a corner, a young novice is sketching with charcoal on a scrap of parchment an outline of flavor notes, complete with symbols for sweetness, sharpness, and barrel funk. It's a proto-chart, something that wouldn't look out of place in a hipster brewery today. You laugh, gently, and sip again. What these women lacked in formal education, they made up for in practical genius. Brewing wasn't a side hobby. It was chemistry before chemistry, gastronomy before the word existed. And while the monks might have had flashier scriptoriums, it's here, in this dim, smoky room, that something truly miraculous is being transcribed. The complex, living language of taste. The nuns don't call it that. They just nod, take notes, and stir. But you're starting to believe they brewed better, not in spite of being women, but because of it. You step into the cool shade of the convent's archive room. A stone chamber lined with shelves sagging under the weight of old ledgers, parchment rolls, and a few forgotten goblets. Dust motes dance in the filtered light as you trail a finger across the spine of one well-worn brewing journal, its cover marked simply *Annus Domini 1280 for a Tessellarium*. Inside, page after page of elegant but hurried Latin script describes mash times, ratios, and weather notations. But what really catches your eye is this. Scattered between recipes are margin notes in a different hand, simpler and slightly wobbly, almost definitely added later. They read things like Sister says Munt beer to frothy ruined last fast. Taste from St. Albans brew, sour, smug. Send brother brewer gingerbread as peace gift. You chuckle. Evidently, this was no solitary effort. These brewing nuns weren't working in a vacuum. They were being watched, studied, and in some cases copied. You flip a few more pages and find a folded letter tucked between sheets. It's from a neighboring abbey, addressed to the esteemed sisters of Our Lady of Hops, and written in delightfully fuzzy Latin. It congratulates them on their blessed product and includes a veiled question about achieving such smooth bitterness without cinnamon bark. So the monks were asking questions. Historians still argue whether male monasteries ever officially credited their sisterly counterparts for brewing inspiration. But surviving notes suggest a lot of, let's call it parallel development. You wouldn't steal from the Lord's brides, of course. You just pray near their fermenters. Maybe ask about barrel sizes for academic purposes. In one Flemish account, monks actually sent barrels of their own beer to nuns for feedback. The record doesn't mention whether they liked what they heard, but does say the nuns returned the barrels emptier than expected. You peer at another volume, a recipe book likely compiled over a century. It has bookmarks made of hair ribbons, and a dog-eared page labeled remedies. Beneath it, beer for sleep, beer for cough, beer for melancholy, beer for childbirth pains, The same brew for multiple purposes, or a different blend each time. Historians debate this too, because nothing was standardized, at least not yet. And then there are the quiet rivalries. One market day, you're told, a monk showed up to a fair with 4 barrels of newly brewed ale, claiming it eased the conscience. A nun from the convent calmly rolled up with 2 barrels labeled eases the rest. The story goes she sold out in under an hour. There's a peculiar tension in this siblinghood of faith. No one's drawing swords unless you count stirring paddles, but the pride is real. One convent in Normandy reportedly used silk tags on its barrels, just to subtly one-up the local monastery that sealed its casks with linen. Another anecdote: when a particularly arrogant friar accused a nun of wasting time on worldly pleasures, she supposedly handed him a mug of her best brew and said, "Tell me, Father, does this taste of vanity?" He drank the whole thing. You're beginning to realize that these weren't just brewers, they were quiet revolutionaries. Not with sermons or banners, but with barley and patience. Their tools weren't swords, they were paddles, ladles, and yeast jars. And the battlefield, your taste buds. You return the letter to its hiding place, suddenly protective of its secrets. These quiet contests never made it into the grand chronicles of kings or saints, but they mattered. They defined taste. They shaped community. They made history foam at the edges. And as you step out of the archive and into the late afternoon light, you wonder how many other monks tasted greatness, only to realize it was brewed by the competition. You're back in the courtyard now, watching a line of carts roll in for the monthly fair. The convent gates are open, and for once, The quiet hum of daily life gives way to a lively murmur. Traders, locals, travelers with dust on their cloaks and coins in their palms. The nuns have set up a small stall by the gate, discreet but deliberate. And right at the center of it, gleaming in the sun, are barrels. You lean against the edge of a stone well, sipping from a clay mug labeled *Vesper Gold*. When the first dispute begins, a portly monk from a nearby abbey waddles up, tugging at his belt with the kind of righteous energy that can only mean trouble or insecurity. He eyes the nun's display, sniffs once, and announces, aromatic, but lacks depth. He hasn't even tasted it. Sister Clara doesn't flinch. She pours him a sample, hands it over with a smile so serene it should be suspicious. He sips, he blinks, then he mumbles something about overhopped youthfulness and shuffles off to a different booth. It's not just him. A steady stream of pilgrims and vendors stop by to taste the convent's latest batch. Some are curious, some are skeptical, a few are downright competitive, especially when the monks arrive with their own barrels. The label says Monastery Red. The subtext says, please like us more. You decide to try both. Monastery Red is strong, herbal, and a bit bitter, like something that thinks it's more profound than it really is. The convent's *Vesper Gold*, by contrast, is smooth, floral, with a hint of elderflower and roasted oats. You finish the convent's first. A local cheese seller shrugs and says what everyone's thinking. Monks preach, nuns brew. One friar mutters something about sacrilege and stalks off to reorganize his linen cups. It's not open warfare, but it's close. A passive-aggressive feud played out in sips and raised eyebrows. You catch whispers of past fairs where monks accuse nuns of tempting the public, of inflating their reputation with improper brewing enthusiasm. One even hinted at divine interference because surely mortal women couldn't naturally make ale that good. Historians still argue whether these rivalries were exaggerated in retrospect. Some say it was mostly friendly. Others point to written complaints lodged with bishops. One letter from a Carthusian brother describes an unseemly gathering where the sisters dispensed intoxicants more eagerly than blessings. He then asked for 2 barrels for further testing. You can't make this up. You notice the subtle tactics in play. The monks have brought decorative banners, chanting novices, even a carved oak sign. The nuns, just barrels, smiles, and consistent flavor. And slowly but surely, the line at the convent stall grows longer. It's a simple truth. Good beer doesn't need a sermon. At one point, Sister Agnes brings out a jug labeled Healing Brew. A child's mother asks what it heals. Loneliness, Agnes says without missing a beat. The crowd laughs. The monk who stalls over scowls. Then plot twist, a blind tasting contest is announced. 3 barrels, no labels, 1 winner. The judge, a local noblewoman with a notorious palate and no patience for a theological drama. You watch as the mugs are filled, passed, and sampled. The judge leans back, chewing her lip. The crowd waits. A card creaks somewhere. Someone sneezes. A dog barks. She points. And just like that, the nuns win. No fanfare, no fireworks. Just a single raised eyebrow, and the kind of nod that carries centuries of understated triumph. You glance over at Clara. She's polishing a ladle. She never even looked up. As the fair winds down and barrels rattle empty, a shift takes place in the convent's brewing rhythm. Tonight's task is not about market stalls or blind taste tests. It's about healing, because the next batch isn't meant to delight the palate. It's medicine. You return to the brew house and notice a different atmosphere. No playful winks, no teasing. Just quiet concentration as the sisters prepare ingredients you haven't seen before. Dried yarrow, horehound, ground ivy, even a few pods of something that smells suspiciously like fennel. On the table lies a folded list marked * pilgrims and pestilence. *, it's not dramatic, just organized. A name, an ailment, a strength ratio. You realize this batch of beer is meant for the sick. In the medieval world, medicine was improv theater, and beer played a starring role. The alcohol killed off dangerous microbes well. Some of them, and the herbs added did the rest, calming the stomach, easing fevers, fighting infection in the only way people could back then, with hope and warm liquid. You help stir the first blend. This one's for a Sister Anna, who's been coughing at Vespers. It includes hyssop and honey. Another batch for a visiting friar with what's generously labeled digestive distress, calls for chamomile and wild mint. There's no thermometer, no lab coat, just intuition and memory, passed down from sister to sister like sacred recipes. And let's be honest, given the state of medieval medicine, these beers might have been the safest treatments round. A quirky fact for you: in some convents, each nun had her own herb blend she swore by, and the abbess would rotate them by ailment, not unlike a modern pharmacist. One 14th century German manuscript refers to these as *Brewerinnen Keruterkarten *Brewers Herbecards. You love that phrase more than you probably should. Now, here's a fun twist: some of these medicinal beers were very strong, not because of indulgence, but because alcohol helped extract and preserve medicinal properties. You hear Sister Clara whisper to another novice, "This one needs a kick." She's referring to the batch with willow bark and cloves, the convent's version of aspirin, brewed thick and sharp. Pilgrims who arrived feverish or worn down from the road were offered this ale first. And if they made a donation, well, that helped buy more barley. The fire in the corner of the brew house crackles a little louder now. The air smells less like toast and more like spice. One nun is crushing dried rose hips in a mortar. Another is heating a tincture of rosemary and mugwort. You pause at the door to the infirmary, where the casks have already been rolled in. The sisters pour small servings into ceramic cups and hand them to pale, wheezing guests who sip slowly. Some wrinkle their noses, some sigh in relief. It's not a cure, but it's comfort. And sometimes that's enough. Historians still argue whether these healing brews were actually effective or simply a spiritual placebo. But isn't that kind of the same thing? When you're desperate. One traveler, quoted in a 15th century travel journal, claimed the beer at a certain convent cleared the lungs better than to Hail Marys and a leeching. We'll take his word for it. Back in the brew house, the final batch of the night is being stirred. This one isn't labeled for an illness, it's for the sisters themselves. A calm, soft brew, meant to be sipped during evening reflection. It includes lavender, oats, and a little thyme. As the sun dips below the horizon and shadows stretch across the courtyard, you realize something strange and beautiful. These nuns didn't just brew beer to live, they brewed it to soothe, to shelter, and sometimes to say goodbye. A bell rings in the distance, not for prayers, for a rest. Later that night, as the convent slips into hush and moonlight, you find yourself wandering the cloisters. Most doors are closed now, the flicker of candlelight behind just a few. But near the chapel, there's a faint scent that doesn't belong. Hops. You follow it down a narrow hallway into the scriptorium, not where beer is brewed, but where knowledge is stored. And that's when you see it, an open psalter on a lectern, its pages illuminated in gold and deep blue, and stained with something suspiciously dark and sticky near the margins. Sister Clara is there too, staring down at it, her face unreadable. She notices you, raises an eyebrow, and points to the stain. "Not wine," she whispers. "That's hops." You move closer. There's no mistaking it, yellow-green residue, just a smudge, dried into the edge of Psalm 68. "Let God rise, and let his enemies be scattered." Quite the dramatic passage to have seasoned with ale. And suddenly, the whispers you've heard all day come together. There was once a scandal, a brewing accident, or perhaps sabotage. The story goes that one of the sisters, either in haste or mischief, spilled an entire ladle of hopped wort on a choir book. It dried, it stained, it smelled, and for weeks, the nuns sang hymns that reeked of beer. You sit down on a worn bench, imagining the scene. Nuns gagging politely, others fanning the pages, one trying to wipe it off with lavender water. No use, the smell lingered. Some say it led to a minor reprimand from the bishop. Others claim the abbess simply moved the book to a lower shelf and declared it penance. Historians still argue whether this was deliberate vandalism or an honest mistake. You suspect it was both. The curious thing is that no one removed the page. It wasn't blotted out or rewritten. It stayed, as if the beer and the psalms could coexist. That's the heart of the story, isn't it? You run your fingers along the other pages. Some of the margins are annotated, not with commentary, but with numbers, fractions, ratios, notes on temperatures and herbs. Someone used this holy book to test brewing techniques. One corner reads, asterisk try to parts rosemary. One mug nettle boil no more than 3 Lord's Prayers, asterisk. Elsewhere, asterisk bitter on mouth. Good aftertaste Sister Agnes agrees, asterisk. It's not graffiti, it's a record of care. A quirky tidbit. There's a rumor unconfirmed, of course, that some convents hid recipes inside hymnals on purpose. If caught, they could claim it was devotional marginalia. If not, they preserved their secrets in plain sight. The page turns softly under your fingers. You half expect to find more scribbled brewing notes, maybe a sketch of a barrel or a list of saints who liked their ale strong. But instead, you find a miniature painted image of a nun holding a cup toward a radiant halo in the sky. Beneath it, in small script, asterisk, he filleth my cup to the brim. Asterisk, you smile. The line's not about beer, but here, tonight, it kind of is. You leave the scriptorium with a strange warmth in your chest. These weren't women trying to escape the world. They were engaging with it silently, cleverly, and with just enough stubbornness to leave a mark. And sometimes that mark smelled like hops. The chapel bell rings softly as you cross the courtyard again, the low notes rolling through the night like warm waves. But you're not heading to prayer. Tonight, you're chasing a rumor. You duck into a side corridor that smells faintly of beeswax and damp stone, guided by the memory of something Clara mentioned earlier. Asterisk, the musical one hides things. Asterisk, you find yourself in a music room small, unadorned, with benches, scroll racks, and a single reed organ pushed into a corner. On the center table rests a hymnal, bound in leather so old it's softened at the corners. You lift it carefully. The notes inside are beautiful, delicate neumes penned in red and black, trailing across pages like little ladders to heaven. But you're not here for the music. You flip through slowly, page by page, until you find it. Not hidden, exactly just asterisk blended, asterisk. Between lines of asterisk. Telusis antiterminum asterisk lie something that isn't Latin. Tiny numbers, ratios, brewing instructions scrawled in the margins, right between protect us through the silent hours and let no ill dreams disturb our peace. The beer recipe, it turns out, asterisk is asterisk the prayer. You squint at the scribbled code, asterisk boil grain until shadows reach halfway across the courtyard wall. Asterisk add herbs before the 4th antiphon. Asterisk let rest until the scent of oak's candle smoke and last summer's peaches. Asterisk, it's not precise, but it's poetic. And you realize this wasn't meant to be hidden. It was meant to be lived. This is the convent's seasonal ale, a special brew made only during Lent, when food is sparse and spirits sag. And it's unlike any you've tried so far. Fewer grains, more herbs, rosemary, sage, a hint of fennel. A thinner beer, yes, but not flavorless. More like a tonic, carefully balanced between necessity and beauty. Historians still debate whether this was purely religious practice or clever economics. Brewing a low-grained ale meant rationing ingredients. But using herbs, that was genius. It stretched flavor without wasting barley. Some say the idea originated in France. Others point to convents in the Low Countries. Either way, the nuns were the ones who perfected it. You follow your nose back to the brew house, where the new batch is already bubbling. Sister Agnes stirs with one hand and holds a candle in the other, gauging the shadows on the wall just like the note described. She doesn't use a sundial. She uses memory. You peer into the pot and inhale. It smells wild, resinous, sharp, with a citrusy finish. She dips a ladle, sips, and smiles with a quiet satisfaction that says, *yes. That's the one, *. A quirky little tradition. Some convents added an extra step at this point. A psalm sung directly into the pot. Not because it flavored the beer, although who knows, but because it blessed it. In one surviving account, a sister wrote, *, we gave it voice, so it may warm voices in return. * you're tempted to try. You hum a few bars quietly, just for yourself, and the steam curls round your face like incense. Later, as the batch is transferred to barrels, you notice something else, the markings. Each barrel bears not only the season and recipe, but a single word, etched with care. Patience, warmth, clarity, mercy, not brand names, not beer styles, intentions. You help roll one into the cellar and feel the weight not just of wood and liquid, but of continuity. These weren't random experiments, they were rituals. Year after year, ale after ale, these women brewed their faith into something you could taste. And maybe, just maybe, that's why theirs was better. Morning again. The sky blushes pale orange as you shuffle down the stone corridor toward the convent kitchen, lured by the mingling scents of bread and wood smoke. But before the first loaf is pulled from the oven, you pass a side room where the mood feels tense. You pause at the threshold. Inside, two sisters stand facing each other over a table covered in parchment, scraps of fabric, and oddly enough a handful of wheat stalks. Their voices are hushed but pointed, hands gesturing like conductors mid-duet. It's a debate, a serious one, and it centers on something deceptively simple: wheat. You inch closer and gather the story in fragments. It seems Sister Agnes believes the abbey is short on barley. Sister Beatrix suspects that's an excuse to switch to wheat-based grist. Why does that matter? Because wheat is richer, rarer, and traditionally reserved for monks. Yes, even in grain, gender politics seep in. You soon learn this isn't an isolated squabble. It's part of a larger pattern known quietly among historians as the *wheat wars *unofficial, unwritten, and all too real. You see, grain was currency in the Middle Ages. Convents that brewed needed access to steady supplies, but they were often lower on the distribution ladder than male monasteries. Some had to barter, others had to beg, and a few, like this one, grew their own but only in modest plots, easily ravaged by weather or, let's be honest, pigs. In many towns, abbots had the right to collect grain first during harvest. That left the sisters scrapping over what remained. Sometimes that meant brewing with oats, sometimes rye, and occasionally weeds. You help Clara carry a sack of mixed grains from the storeroom to the mill house, where a heavy stone wheel waits. She opens the sack, frowns, and plucks out a withered acorn. Again, she mutters, another quirky tidbit. During lean years, some convents secretly sprouted grains early to fool tax collectors into thinking they had less stock. It wasn't technically lying, it was agricultural strategy. As the wheel turns and the grains are ground, the room fills with dust and heat. Clara hums a familiar chant, steadying the rhythm. You ask if Sister Beatrix will accept the switch to wheat. Clara shrugs and says she will when she tastes it. Conflict, it seems, resolves best at the lip of a mug. Back in the courtyard, a few barrels wait to be tapped. One is marked with 3 black dots, code for experimental batch. The word spreads quickly. Even the abbess appears, cup in hand. You try it first. It's softer, silkier than the others. A honeyed sweetness layered with a bitter bite that arrives late, but lingers, like a polite rebuke. You glance over to Beatrix. She nods, slow and skeptical. "We'll ration the wheat," she says. "The peace is temporary, sure, but you can see how it's always been this way. Negotiation brewed in real time, between grain and spirit, palate and power." Historians still argue whether nuns had full control over their recipes. Some say they followed strict community rules. Others claim the abbess often left them to manage the brewing however they liked, so long as the barrels were full and the tithes paid. You begin to understand that brewing was never just a kitchen task. It was logistics, diplomacy, even quiet rebellion. A way to carve dignity from doughy politics. As you help roll the last barrel into the storeroom, Clara slaps a new label onto the side. It reads, *sistered pale. * you laugh. Because here, in this place of veils and vows, they don't just brew beer, they brew balance. You find yourself seated at a wooden bench near the scriptorium wall, flipping through a stack of loosely bound court documents, not sacred texts this time, but records of trouble, legal trouble, because as strange as it sounds, there was once a time when nuns were fined for brewing beer to well *. You trace the first documents in lines dated 1379. In stiff clerical Latin and slowly piece together the incident. The sisters of this particular convent had produced a batch of ale described by a visiting bishop as excessively merry. His words, not yours. That same week, lay brothers were found singing off-key psalms in the tavern, while a visiting deacon reportedly mistook a lantern for the Holy Spirit. The connection? They'd all drunk from a barrel marked Sancta Fortis, a new high-strength brew devised for medicinal use. Also, the abbess claimed the town council didn't see it that way. They fined the convent for peddling unregulated intoxicants, demanded the remaining stock be confiscated, and sent a warning to the diocese. The punishment? A temporary suspension from selling outside the convent walls. You picture the nuns reading the letter, silent as ever, maybe passing it round during evening stew. One of them probably snorted. Another suggested adding water next time. But you're almost certain Sister Clara, had she been there, would have whispered. They came back for more, didn't they? Here's the wildest part. They did *. The records show that within months, the bishop reversed the ban not out of mercy, but necessity. The town's water supply had fouled again, and the convents to strong ale, it was suddenly rebranded as health aid. Historians still argue whether this was bureaucratic backpedaling or divine irony. Either way, the beer was back in circulation, and the fine was quietly erased. And that wasn't the only case. In 15th century Bavaria, another convent faced charges not for brewing strong ale, but for brewing better ale than the local monastery. Their beer outsold the monks by such a margin that town merchants complained. A monk wrote bitterly in his ledger, "Their barrels rive blessed and leave empty." Eventually, the monks pressured the local lord to place a cap on female-made spirits. The sisters responded legally, of course by splitting their batches in two, one for spiritual use and another for guest nourishment. And the caps, well, they simply brewed more frequently *. It's a quirky game of semantics, and the nuns played it masterfully. You peer into the brew house, where a fresh label is being affixed to a cask. It says Vigil Draft. A new name, probably, maybe the same recipe, but the message is clear. You can find the nuns, but you can't and teach the art. There's a word carved into the bench beneath your fingertips, *GRASILO*, *to bounce back. You suspect it wasn't just the woodcarver's motto. It was a quiet vow. So much of this brewing history survives not in grand tomes but in court records, fines, and scribbled notes. The resistance wasn't loud. It wasn't written in fiery manifestos. It was measured in yeast jars hidden in root cellars and in mugs handed out with soft grins and sharper recipes. You glance across the courtyard, where Clara is laughing with two novices, teaching them to balance full barrels on a tilted cart. She's not just passing on muscle memory, she's passing on strategy. Because here, beer wasn't rebellion, it was rebuttal. You sit on the steps of the convent's back cellar, arms resting on your knees, watching the sun pull long fingers of light across the yard. The air is thick with the scent of yeast, damp earth, and cooling wood. Somewhere nearby, someone baking pears with clove and brown sugar, probably for a name day feast. But your mind is on a bigger question now. The big one. Did nuns actually brew better beer than monks? Clara joins you, lowering herself with a satisfied grunt and placing two mugs on the stone between you. One is marked with a charcoal cross, the other with a faint flower. No labels, no hints, just taste. You sip the first. Dry, herbal, a little bitter, clearly deliberate, even if the finish bites back. The second, smooth, warm, a bloom of flavor that feels like a conversation slowly unfolding. You don't need to ask which is which. So back to the question. The myth, the claim that has tickled historians, beer scholars, and more than a few of her confident tour guides, that nuns brewed the superior beer. Let's examine the facts. First, consistency. Many convents, especially Benedictine ones, kept detailed logs of brew cycles, weather, and ingredient notes. Their brewing was a long-term project. Some Malabes, on the other hand, cycled monks through brewing duty more sporadically, treating it as a temporary chore rather than a specialty. Second, the audience. Monks often brewed for feasts, guests, and tithe consumption, publicly praised. Yes, but inconsistent in quality. Nuns, by contrast, brewed primarily for themselves, the sick, and nearby locals. Their reputation spread quietly, mouth to mouth, mug to mug. Third, creativity. Records suggest nuns experimented more with herbs and non-traditional ingredients. Why? Because they had fewer resources. Constraints sparked invention. A pinch of wormwood, a trace of licorice root, or lemon balm grown in a forgotten corner of the cloister garden. These added layers monks often ignored. And finally, the reviews. A fringe scholar named Brother Henricus of Mainz once wrote, rather reluctantly, their cups are small, but their brews are wise. A left-handed compliment, maybe, but also a confession. Still, historians debate it. Some point out that male monasteries had greater access to imported hops, better trade networks, and larger grain stores. Others note that male scribes who wrote most of the surviving records were far more likely to document their own successes. The brewing sisters didn't self-promote. They just brewed. You shift on the stone step, lifting your mug again. The nun's beer is warming now, mellowing into something honey-soft. You feel it settle in your chest like a memory. The abbess pauses, nods once, and disappears down a path toward the garden. Clara doesn't ask for your verdict. She just leans back, folds her arms, and smiles at the horizon. You remember the blind taste test from the fair, the hesitant nod from the judge, the way the crowd leaned toward the sisters without needing to be convinced. The truth is, better isn't always about flavor. It's about care. It's about hands that stood each batch with intent, who knew that someone's dinner, someone's healing, someone's peace of mind depended on what bubbled in the barrel. Brewing, here, wasn't just production. It was participation. It was prayer. And when you compare that to the bustle and bluster of monastic brewers with their banners and bells, maybe it's not even a fair fight. The convent didn't just brew beer. They brewed dignity, one small barrel at a time. The light is fading again, and as dusk stretches over the cloisters, you find yourself drawn to the edge of the convent garden, where a group of sisters are gathered round a large kettle outdoors this time, beneath the wide sky. This isn't the brew house. It's older, rougher. The stones are blackened with soot. And the brew, it smells different. Earthier, smokier. You ask, and one of the novices grins. The last brew, not ominous, just tradition. This batch, she explains, is always brewed at twilight on the final day of the brewing cycle, just before the season shifts or a new moon rises. It's smaller, stronger, poured into just 1 or 2 special barrels. Not for trade, not for healing, not for the bishop's cellar. This one is for the sisters. You sit by the fire as Clara ladles out ingredients in slow, practiced motions. Barley, of course, but also blackberries, burnt orange peel, crushed clove, and something else, sandalwood. You don't even ask. Each sister contributes 1 ingredient, nothing written down. No recipe, no name. Just taste, memory, and the long thread of community. They stir in silence, passing the paddle from hand to hand like a ritual object. You watch the steam rise and feel it cling to your skin. Somewhere above, a bat darts across the violet sky. There's a quiet reverence to this brew, but not the rigid kind. This isn't solemnity, it's comfort, it's farewell. The brewing is done for the month, maybe the season. The fields will rest, the barrels will age, life will carry on. Sister Agnes kneels beside you and explains that every last brew is different. Sometimes it's sweet, sometimes bitter, sometimes perfect, sometimes not. But it always gets made, not to be sold, not even necessarily to be finished, just to exist. A record, she says, of who we were this month. That lands harder than you expect. Historians barely mention the last brew. A few surviving notes call it the Sisters' Vigil batch. One 15th century convent logbook refers to it as *quietus pour la fin du labor. *pour for the end of labor. You stir slowly, trying to imagine monks doing this. Maybe they did, but you doubt they sang while they did it. Softly, in harmony, without words. Just hums, just warmth. Clara hands you a mug once again. You sip, it's smoky, spiced, oddly floral. The heat lingers on your tongue like the last line of a lullaby. You look round the circle. No one's talking. No one needs to. They're tired, a little soot-smudged, but content. A quirky tradition. The sisters say the last brew must always be poured in silence. The first sip too. After that, laughter is allowed. But only after. You watch them pour into a barrel marked not with a label, but with a simple etched symbol. A small circle within a larger one. What does it mean? You whisper. Clara shrugs. Wholeness, she says. Then pauses. Or maybe, just us. You sit with that. As the sky darkens and the stars arrive one by one, the sisters rise, brush off their robes, and begin returning inside. One of them leaves a single candle burning beside the barrel, not for light, for a memory. And you realize this might be your favorite brew, yet not because it's the best, but because it understands something most people forget. Not every sip needs to be explained. Some are just meant to be shared. It's late now, really late. The kind of quiet that presses in from the edges, soft and total. The convent is sleeping. Or nearly so, and only the tiniest creaks from old beams and the soft sigh of the night wind break the stillness. But you're not in your cell. You're in the cellar, not the public cellar, not the main one. This is the old cellar, the one behind the stone archway, down the narrow stairwell slick with time. Clara leads you here without speaking, lantern in hand, her silhouette casting long shadows on the walls. She opens the door. The air that greets you is cool, dry, and smells like old earth, cedar, and faint traces of fermenting dreams. In the far corner sits one last barrel low, wide, bound in iron hoops gone grey with age. Its wood is dark and worn, but lovingly maintained. A single linen cloth rests across the top. Clara folds it back, revealing a carved lid. No markings, no labels, just smooth wood and the faint shimmer of beeswax polish. She nods once, slowly. This is the oldest brew, not in age though it's been aging a while, but in lineage. The recipe it holds is believed to be the original, the very first the convent ever made, passed down, quietly, through 200 years of sisters. And changed. You run your hand along the side of the barrel, feel the chill, the slight give of the grain under your fingertips. You ask if she's tasted it. Only once, she replies. When I became brewmistress. You watch as she draws a small sample into a glass then, gold amber, with just a hint of foam. It gleams in the lamplight like stained glass. You sip, and everything is still. The taste is delicate like malt, dried fig, a soft herbal edge that disappears just as you try to place it. But what strikes you isn't flavor, it's feeling. You're not drinking beer, you're drinking history. You close your eyes. You can almost hear the hands that stirred it centuries ago. See the garden where the herbs were gathered. Smell the straw floor of the old brew house. The past doesn't knock here, it opens the door and sits beside you. Clara places her glass down and rests her hand on the barrel. This, she says softly, isn't for sale, isn't for sickness, it's for remembrance. There's a pause, then, with a small smile, and sometimes for funerals. It makes sense. Some stories deserve to be sipped at the end, not shouted, not sold, just shared in silence. With those who remember. You look round the old cellar, where cobwebs cling like lace to the corners and the stones breathe with slow, forgotten warmth. You think of everything you've seen, the tastings, the scandals, the rivalries, the healing mugs, and the hushed batches brewed by starlight. You remember the girl in the archive tracing hop stains beside Psalms, the barrel-marked mercy, the whisper-sung recipe hidden in music. The smile of a sister who knew her beer said more than her vows. And you realize now, the question was never did they brew better than the monks. It was, and always will be, did they brew with love? Yes, yes, they did. And now, as the final notes of this tale fade into the quiet spaces of your room, let your breath slow, let your shoulders soften. Imagine the last light of a candle flickering in a convent window, its tiny flame swaying against centuries of stone. A few barrels rest cool in the cellar. The herbs are hung to dry. The night air carries a whisper of malt and lavender. The sisters have finished their prayers, folded their hands, and returned to dreams where barley fields roll gently under moonlight. You too, now, are part of that quiet rhythm. A guest in their story, a sip in their cycle. Let the sounds fall away, the kettles bubble, the scrape of ladles, the footsteps across chapel floors. All of it softens now, drifting further from your waking mind. There is no rush, no burden, no call to rise early. Only stillness and stories that wrap round you like the steam from a warm mug, unrushed, unspoken, known. You're safe here. You're home in history's quiet corner. And somewhere, deep in that imaginary cellar of your thoughts, the last barrel waits, perfectly aged, not for a celebration or mourning, but for this moment. Exactly. Close your eyes. Let go. Sleep well.